The morning the bells of the great September shivered the city awake. John Arryn lay on a pallet instead of his feather mattress, staring up into the dim rafters of his solar as if the wood itself could be forced to give an answer. The old man's breathing came slow and even, a deliberate thing, as though he disciplined his own lungs lest they betray the panic that pressed at his ribs. He had moved his bed in the night. It was an absurd precaution for a man of his years and honors, and yet he had taken it without hesitation. The pigeon-blood garnet ring that marked him hand of the king sat in a bowl of water on the floor. Beside it, under a folded cloth, lay the small leather skin of wine Lisa had pressed on him with trembling hands. "To help you sleep," she had whispered, so tenderly he had thought of the girl she had been. Not the woman bent by grief and a too eager love. He had not drunk it. The smell had been perfect. That was the trouble. Outside, the red keep woke in layers. Gutters sloshed, doors slammed, the rasp of straw brooms along tiles, the mutter of guards too proud to complain of the hour. Far below, the city turned a gray shoulder to the dawn. Smokestacks without smoke, the river slack and sullen, gulls beating hollow wings against the wind. He had been born to mountains and stone and air that came thin and clean into the lungs. King's Landing felt like a damp blanket pressed over the face. Even now, after so many years, he had to force his mind to sharpen in its sluggish heat. He rose. His bones protested, his left knee sent up a hot needle of complaint, and he ignored both. When the boy came with a basin he washed carefully, and made the sign he had learned in the Vale, forgetting, again, that here in the south the gods had different faces. He put on plain clothing under the embroidered doublet of his office, a belt that sat too loosely on his waist, the heavy chain with the hand sigil. Every gesture was deliberate. He paused only once, fingers hovering over a thin volume bound in black calfskin. The book had an odor of old ink and oil. He had carried it like a guilty thing for weeks, tucked under his arm and wrapped in a cloth, as if its title were treason when read by the wrong eyes. The script within was the tidy hand of scholars, but the conclusions it led to were as brutal as an axe stroke. Lineages and histories, marriages and births, every name counted and balanced. On a page whose corners had gone soft, he traced his finger across a simple table that reduced the lives of lords to hair color. The first time he had read the pattern he had laughed, a short, embarrassed sound in the empty room, surprised by the banality of it. He was a veteran of rebellions, not a midwife, but the black stubborn dominance repeated itself with a patience no man dared challenge. Storms end bred the same way for 1,000 years. And then there were 3 princes and a princess in the red keep with hair like beaten gold. His door opened without a knock. He did not need to turn to know who it was. The room itself seemed to grow narrower, plainer. Stannis Baratheon had no perfume to announce him, no rustle of silk, no easy charm. "Close the door," Jon said. Stannis did so. He wore a dark doublet with the flame-hearted stag stitched in thread that had once been gold before hard wear and salt air made it dull. The man's jaw looked carved, his mouth thin. He had not slept either. Jon suspected Stannis had simply stood and waited for dawn like a siege engine waits beside a wall. "Have you eaten?" Jon asked. "No." "Good. Then we are of one mind, for once." Stannis's eyes went to the book, then to the bowl on the floor. He saw too much and judged too quickly. Those who called him humorless failed to understand that he understood jokes very well and simply disliked the ways they excused sin. "You think they will try again?" he asked, almost without inflection. If the tears of Lys were in the wine, they would leave no stain, no cough. There would be a fever, a failing, the kind of dying the Grand Maester would sigh over and call the passing of time. The city would call it a mercy that the hand, grown old in service, surrendered to sleep. Jon Arryn had been naive long and hard enough to learn what such mercies cost other men. "I think too many people have too much to lose," Jon said. "And some of them have courage." "Courage?" Stannis barked the barest hint of a laugh. "Call it what it is. Bride. This secret, once spoken aloud, will make a liar of more than a queen, or a fool of a king." "I never took you for a man soft with pity," Jon said dryly. "You are not wrong." Stannis's gaze softened, but only because he was looking backward at a boy running along a cliff with his brothers. If I had pity, it is used up. The king is my brother. I will see him kept from dishonor if I can. If not, he left the end sheared as he left most things. Words were nails to him, and he hammered only until they held. Jon lifted the book and slipped it under his arm. He put on a plain cloak despite the weight of spring already in the air, and took up his cane, though he did not need it. The cane, like the cloak, made him look older and slower than he was. Let anyone watching see a tired man who would die soon and safely. Let their shoulders unknot. Where? Stannis asked. The September, Jon said, and watched the distaste pass over Stannis's face. We will bring the king and the court and the people, and we will read from a book. It seems mad, so I suppose it will work. Renly will laugh, Stannis said. Renly laughs at his own breath in cold air, Jon answered. He has never known air cold enough for that. This will be different. They left his solar by the rear stairs, through a door that servants used and guards forgot. In the corridor outside, they nearly collided with Lysa. She stopped with such suddenness her hair slid forward like a red curtain. Her hand clutched a basket. The lids of her eyes were red, her mouth the pale pink of a girl's dress cut down to fit a widow. When she saw the book tucked under his arm, her mouth twitched like a horse's muzzle, uncertain whether to bite or nuzzle. You did not drink, she said. No, Jon said. Her gaze darted to the bowl. The basket in her hands shifted, and he smelled sweet rolls, thick with honey. She had remembered his fondness for them when his teeth ached in winter. He felt a strange tenderness and, beneath it, anger, as one feels for a child who has learned to lie and does it badly. I needed to be clear this morning, he said gently. Forgive me. Lisa's face opened like a wound. Forgive? There is nothing to forgive. I only wanted... Her voice thinned, the way it had when she had once asked him to send the boy at court away because the boy had laughed too loudly. You should not go out, my lord. You should not go to the September. The air is foul there, and the crowd. Lysa, he said softly, and she stopped. Stannis watched with the concentrated expression he reserved for storms at sea. Jon spared him a glance to warn him to hold his tongue. I will send for you later. We will pray together for the boy, for Robert Arryn. Lysa nodded, scarcely comprehending. She stared at the basket, then thrust it into his hands, as if offerings could change the course of a river already in flood. For you, the honey is from the veil. Thank you, he said, and did not take it. She thrust it again, and the basket tilted. A small blue-glazed vial rolled from beneath a cloth, tapped once against the stone, and came to rest against Stannis's boot. All three of them looked at it. The room seemed to shrink to the size of the bottle. Color flooded Lisa's face, then left her. For my head, she said, too quickly. It soothes my head. Stannis did not move, his mouth crooked a fraction. I have a head too, he said evenly. He bent, picked up the vial, and held it to the light that was not yet there. I do not think the September will soothe it. Lysa swayed. For a heartbeat Jon thought she would strike Stannis. Instead, she went still, then bowed with a graceless, courtly dip she had been taught as a girl. When she lifted her head, her eyes were flat. I will pray, she said, for the king. And for the truth, Jon said. He watched her until she vanished toward the women's hall. He felt nothing like triumph. He felt old. They gathered the guards not for parade but for function. The men Stannis chose were from the Harbor Watch, men who had seen storms and did not love anyone's colors more than they loved their own wages. Ser Barristan Selmy joined them without a word and stood with his weight balanced, a man who had learned long ago to be his own fulcrum. Grand Maester Pycelle huffed protest that the hour was unseemly for such matters. The court did not move until the king moved. Peter Baelish drifted down a stair with half-lidded eyes and a smile that looked like a ribbon laid across a trap. Varys arrived already present, as if he had unfolded from the paneling like a moth. Renly came last, hair shining, cloak falling just so. He took one look at Jon's face and swallowed his joke. "Where is the king?" Jon asked. "Lancel wakes him," Renly said. He was... The younger Baratheon's fingers traced, unconsciously, the shape of a horn. "He will come." "And the queen?" Stannis asked. Renly's gaze flicked toward the West Tower. "She is already in the September." He lied too easily. They made a slow procession. The streets of the city were washed for once by last night's rain, and the light that found the river came gray and sincere. Small folk came out of doorways like ants when the earth has been disturbed. They watched with boldness born of numbers. The gold cloaks kept a path with the flat ends of their spears. By the time they reached the Great September, the bells had already begun. A quivering sound like metal trying to speak, and a swell of humanity had thickened at the doors. The High Septon, round and pink as a ham, met them inside with handmaidens of incense. He murmured about the will of the gods with the air of a man repeating a phrase he liked for the weight it lent him. He blessed the king with a damp thumb. Robert's face was gray with drink and a night's hard rest. He wore a heavy linen shirt and a jerkin, his beard unruly and the color of tarnished bronze. His eyes, when they found Jon Arryn, were clear enough. He embraced the old man with sudden force that made Jon's ribs crackle. "You should be in bed," Robert said bluntly. "So should you," Jon answered. Robert hugged Stannis as one slaps a dog, then ruffled Renly's hair. Barristan bowed. Peter's smile dipped. Varys murmured something about the generosity of the morning. Cersei Lannister stood near the altar, her children before her, flanked by white cloaks. Jaime stood with his hand on the pommel of his sword, his face made careless by practice. Joffrey looked out like a lord who had already forgotten he had ever been a boy. The girl's hands worried the lace at her sleeves. The youngest boy glanced up at his sister for cues on how to breathe. Cersei watched the men come and weighed them. Her gaze skittered past Stannis as if refusing to take shape, then found Robert and hardened like ice on a pond. "We come to pray," she said. Her voice carried. "We come to speak," Jon said. The September received sound and made it softer. The light fell through colored glass and made saints on the floor that men had learned to avoid stepping on, out of habit or fear. Jon felt the book under his arm like a brand. He climbed 3 steps and turned to the crowd. He had spoken in halls with snow blowing in stone rooms without windows where only 10 men could fit, but he had never liked public addresses. The trick was to mean every word. "We come to keep the king's honor," he said. The people shifted, the way fields shift when wind presses hand to grain. "We come to keep the realm from folly. We come to tell a truth that will be told whether we speak it or not." Robert's head came up a fraction. Jaime's fingers moved. Barristan's gaze went there. Renly's mouth thinned. Peter Baelish's eyes brightened, as if someone had produced a rare instrument for him to appraise. Jon opened the book. The pages made a dry sound like footsteps in dry grass. He read the title, the author, the date it had been copied. He read 3 lines about traits and their inheritance, named names from ancient days when storm lords still ate with their fingers, when marriage meant a treaty hammered with iron and not sealed with rose water. He turned pages, calmly, until paper itself began to smell like verdict. He spoke of a smith's apprentice with a jaw like a cliff and hair so black a raven would be ashamed to fly near it. He spoke of a little girl downriver with a mother who carried a coin from a king and a shadow at the root of her hair that had not required a question to identify. He spoke, without detail but with direction, of a boy in the Stormlands whose mother had died naming Robert with her last breath. He did not dwell on bastards. He did not pronounce judgment. He held them up as lanterns, not to shame but to illuminate. With every name, with every village described, the crowd's noise changed. Disbelief shifted to a murmur. A murmur shook itself into a pulse. He did not point to Joffrey and say, "Look." He did not point to Myrcella or Tommen as if they had chosen their heads. He lifted the lineages and histories of the great houses and read out the stubborn rule the maesters had copied with board ink. In the high windows, a cloud moved. A stripe of white fell along the floor like a sword's edge. At last he stopped. The bells were silent now. The city held its breath inside the September. "And what is your charge?" Cersei asked. It was a reasonable question. She gave him a reasonable woman's expression. "My charge," Jon said steadily, "is that the king's heirs must be the king's. I submit to the king and the gods that these children are not born from the king's blood." The word treason rattled the bones of the September even unspoken. Robert made a small sound. He did not move. It was a terrible thing what men asked of kings, that they be both fathers and laws, that they know when to be one and when the other. Jon did not look at him. He looked at Barristan, at Stannis, at Renly. He looked at the High Septon, whose lip had been trembling since the second name. Jaime laughed. It was soft. A man who had once slit a king open on a throne could afford soft laughter. "Old men and books," he said. Stannis said, "Answer, then." Cersei took one step forward as if stepping into a painting. "Answer? Answer what? An accusation without witness? A slander shouted in a holy place? Shall I pull up my skirts here in the god's sight to prove what is mine and what is not?" There were those in the September who laughed. Others did not. Jon raised a hand before Stannis could speak again. "Answer our questions," he said gently. "Answer the king's." Robert had still not moved. He did now, and it was a motion that had led armies. He came up the steps beside Jon Arryn until the old man could smell the ghost of last night in his sweat and see the blue lines in the whites of his eyes. Robert did not look at the book. He looked at Cersei, then at the boy with her hair. "Jaime," Robert said, and the name opened the door to something that had lived in him unspoken for too long. "Is it true?" The white cloaks had shifted subtly. Aerys Oakhart had moved closer to Myrcella. Meryn Trant had moved closer to the king without entirely recognizing he had done so. Preston Greenfield regarded a pilgrim with suspicion, as if a pilgrim could end the world with a hidden knife. Barristan stood as he had always stood, between past and present, trying very hard to be useful to both. "Is what true?" Jaime asked pleasantly. "That you've been lying with the queen," Robert said, and the words struck the air like iron plunged into water. Silence, the kind that makes men aware of their fingernails. A poor woman near the back crossed herself 6 times. A man near her lifted his chin to see better. Jaime's mouth curved. "Would you have me deny it? It might hurt your hand's feelings." He prefers his proofs written in a dead maester's hand. Cersei's breath left her audibly. The High Septon made a small hopping motion as if to force himself between words and sin. Renly whispered, "Gods!" Stannis made no sound at all. His eyes said, "At last." Robert swayed, then steadied. For a heartbeat Jon thought the man would draw and cut. He had seen that look when Robert's hammer rose and fell and rose. But Robert had no hammer here, only the heavy hand of a crown he wore poorly. He is about to choose, Jon thought. Either way, the world smooths to a different grain. "The law," Stannis said. Jon realized he had said the words out loud. He sounded, for once, almost gentle. "The law?" Robert repeated dully, as one repeats the name of a ghost he knows, with disgust, will not leave. He closed his eyes and breathed out through his nose. When he opened them, he was king enough for anyone. "Ser Barristan," he said without raising his voice. "Take the queen to her chambers. She is confined. The children as well. Do them no harm." Jaime's blade was half out while Barristan's was still thought of. The Kingslayer did not leap down the steps like a laughing boy. He moved like a man accustomed to killing in rooms. Meryn Trant started, too late to be brave. Boros Blunt's knees thought better of it. Preston Greenfield turned his head too far to judge the distance. Aerys Oakhart's jaw tightened. Barristan came at Jaime without flourish and with such perfect economy of motion that no one in the crowd understood what they were seeing until the Ring of Steel had finished explaining it. They met once, twice. Jaime's sword kissed the stone with a shock that rang up his arm. Barristan T. Okay, a half step, turned the wrist, slid. Jaime recovered with a dancer's sureness. He saw the old man had improved upon age in the way of men who stay alive because they do not tire of art. Jaime smiled in spite of his beating heart. For a heartbeat, he had the look of a man meeting someone worth shouting for. The White Sword book would have a line for this if any survived to write it. 2 white cloaks at the center of a world's hinge. The September gave each of them a saint's light, indifferent as to which one it crowned. "Jaime," Cersei said flatly. It was a command with an old shape worn smooth by use. He hesitated for exactly 1 breath. Barristan used that breath. He drove Jaime back 3 steps without drawing blood. But the 4th step had no stair behind it, and the world reminded them both that its edges are where men die. Jaime rolled, came up in a sweep that should have opened Barristan from hip to heart. It opened Barristan's cloak instead, and the old man's ribs felt the kiss of cold air. The onlookers moaned and cheered, going soft-eyed and savage as all crowds do when granted an inch of death. "Enough," Robert said. His voice carried. He did not shout. The sound made everyone who had ever served him look up like hounds who knew the call. Jaime stopped because Jaime had always loved a line to step over carefully. "Ser Barristan," the king said. "I gave an order." Barristan stepped back. His breath did not show. He had not expected to win or lose. He had expected to obey. He sheathed his sword. "Your Grace," he said. His face was calm. The eyes beneath it were burning. "Ser Jaime," Robert said, "give me your sword." Jaime tilted his head as if considering a kiss from a cousin. No, his smile had begun to look like a cut that would not stop bleeding. "You can kill me." He looked briefly toward the Queen, just briefly, but long enough for Jon Arryn to realize in that small space between man and man how the world is broken and mended. "But I think you won't." The gold cloaks had flowed forward, obedient to a force older than coin, the mathematics of numbers. The crowd behind them pressed, and the September's smooth floor took on the smell of fear. Pycelle shuffled toward the king with hands lifted in lament. Renly had moved behind the king a half-pace, not craven, merely attuned to the direction of blows. Varys watched everything and nothing. Peter's mouth lingered near the simplest sentence. "I can help." Stannis spoke instead. "Janos," he said without looking. The commander of the city watch jerked his head as if someone had struck him. He had been leaning toward Peter. "Your men will take the White Cloak's lead. The Queen and her children are to be placed under guard. Their persons are sacred. Their movements are not." Janos's eyes slid toward their master of coin. Peter's expression did not move at all. He was elegantly disinterested in the man's choice, which was answer enough. Janos licked his lips. He had been bought before. It is the kind of transaction a man can carry under his tongue like a sweet he does not deserve. But something else was in the air. There were too many eyes. There was a king looking at him as if he could see what the man had had for breakfast. Janos nodded. "I am Lord," he said, and to the gold cloaks, "Move." They moved. Not with certainty, not with honor, but because a man carrying a spear and wearing a helmet wants to put that spear somewhere and keep his helmet on. Jaime backed until white met gold. He sheathed his sword because some defeats are tact. He said a single word to Cersei in a language only the 2 of them spoke. She nodded once, as if acknowledging a friend in a crowd. She put her hand on Joffrey's shoulder. Joffrey stiffened, then submitted with very bad grace to the touch of a guard. Robert turned away. He went to a pillar and put his hand against the cool stone as if to convince himself the world still had texture. Stannis stood beside him as a cliff stands beside a storm. Renly looked a very small distance like a child. Jon Arryn closed the book with careful fingers. He had thought he would feel something vast at the moment of revelation. What he felt was tiredness that had been waiting years to be allowed into his bones. They went out to a city that had already guessed more than it had heard. Word carried faster than bells. The Queen led in custody is not a rumor anyone needs repeated to believe. Some wept, a few spat, many watched with the neutral appetite of those educated by markets. The gold cloaks discovered, to their surprise, that guarding royal prisoners felt more like the kind of work that keeps a man alive than fighting sellswords at dockside. Varys's quiet men began moving without seeming to, drawing lines where none had been and making them real. Peter smiled inwardly and reckoned sums. Men, loyalty, time. then tossed the slate and began again because the board had tilted at an angle even he had not predicted. In the Red Keep, a door shut on Cersei Lannister. She stood very straight in her locked room and pressed her palms lightly to the table as if it were someone's face. Joffrey raged in a cage of tapestried walls until he discovered there was no one to watch him besides a frightened servant and a silent guard. Then he sat and schemed. Myrcella took her brother's hand and held it not to soothe him, but because the gesture soothed her. Tommen asked if he would still be allowed to keep his kittens. When told yes, he cried anyway, not with fear but with relief, and then cried again because he had cried in front of a guard. In the council chamber, Jon Arryn laid the black book on the table with a care that made even Renly set aside his jest like a toy too dangerous to play with now. Pycelle made a speech like a poorly constructed table, each leg shaky, the surface uneven. Varys wondered aloud whether public spectacle had been wise, then turned his wonder toward offering to find other bastards the king might want to K. Now of Peter drummed one finger. The treasury is not an elastic purse, he said mildly, which meant nothing at all and sounded like he had confessed a sin. The law, Stannis said again. He looked at the chair at the head of the table, then looked away. Robert came in with no crown and no patience. He had washed his face and set his beard in order. The man who had laughed with Jon in a winter camp over some crude story about a goat had retreated behind the man who had chosen where the hammer fell. He took the chair not because it was a throne, but because his legs wanted to sit. He put his hands on the arms and stared at them. "Your Grace," Jon said. Robert lifted his head. He looked not at Jon but at the space just to his left, where a memory would have stood if he had allowed it. "What now?" he asked. It was the question of any husband dragged to the edge of something he did not choose. "Now you name your heir," Stannis said very calmly. He did not swell with the import of his own advice. He did not kneel and present his own head. He stated a plank. "By law, you disinherit those not of your body. You put the realm on notice, and you decide whether to put the queen to trial or exile." Renly leaned. "Exile?" He made the word shine like an ornament. "Let her go to Casterly Rock and the songs will make it sound like we sent a bride home the morning after the bedding." "The other choice is heads on spikes," Stannis said without looking at him. "Songs can make that shine too. The old gods and the new," Pycelle fluttered. "Abhor. Save your pieties for a softer bench," Robert said. They came gravelly, but without heat. He rubbed his eyes with forefinger and thumb. "If I name Stannis today, we have war with the West before nightfall. If I name Renly..." He glanced at the younger brother, and the corner of his mouth moved. "I have war with the law. Name no one," Peter suggested lightly, "and call a great council. Lords love nothing so much as hearing themselves say what they like best, and then blaming someone else when it goes sour." Stannis looked ready to throw Baelish out the window by his collar and watched the man count windows on the way down. "A council invites Tywin Lannister to bargain with us while his army rides. His army rides if we so much as breathe in a way that displeases him," Varys murmured. "He is a man who has learned to make his breath silent." "Call the banners," Renly said. "If it is war, make it beautiful. I will ride to Highgarden." His smile promised blossoms covering corpses already. "If we promise Marjorie a throne." Robert raised his hand. The air in the room closed gently around the gesture. "I am not dead," he said. The sentence hung in the air like a pennant too heavy for its pole. "I am not dead. I will not be moved like a corpse." Silence. Then Jon Arryn, because old men can sometimes be cruel to their own pupils, smiled so softly only Robert saw it. "Then be king," he said. Robert's laugh was a bark with no joy. He drank water like a man surprised to enjoy it. He looked at Stannis. He looked at Renly. He looked at Jon, and then at a place behind Jon's left shoulder where a wolf might have stood had the king had the sense to bring it south with its master. "Stannis," he said at last. "No ceremony. No prayer." He had never liked either. "You are my heir. And while I live, you will sit this chair when I do not, and you will not use it to warm your arse." Renly's jaw tightened. He bent his head just enough to look well-bred. Peter's fingers stilled briefly over the invisible abacus he carried inside his skull. Varys sighed very quietly, as if a flute had a mind to sympathize with wind. Pycelle made a beaverly show of writing down the words as if ink could forge them iron. "The Queen?" Robert asked, tired of himself. Jon Arryn had thought on this more than he cared to admit. "House Lannister must be made to choose between its pride and its coin," he said. "Pride will send an army. Coin will pay for one. If the Queen dies at our hand, the songs will do the rest of their choosing. If she lives under guard, they are forced to listen to the realm's voice while it speaks. And the children." He stopped. He could not call them that and talk like a clerk. He remembered his own boy, a blue-faced bundle who had refused to take breath until the midwife shook him. He had named him Robert because he had not known how else to thank the god who had started the boy's stubborn breathing. "The children," Stannis finished for him when he stopped, "are not guilty of their begetting. They will be given comfort, education, and a tower with a door that opens only when we say so." Peter spread his hands. "I can arrange expenses," he murmured. "Janos can arrange locks." He smiled cat-like. "If he has no moral qualms." Janos swallowed. Renly rolled his eyes with a dramatist's economy. Varys, whose eyes were instruments built to detect unspent tears and piles of gold buried beneath floorboards, kept his face exactly as it had been. "Done," Robert said. "Word will go to Casterly Rock. Tell Tywin I am willing to speak with him about the future of his house." The last word tasted bitter in his mouth. "I will not have him dictate the future of mine. And send for Ned." The name entered the room like a breath after being held for too long. Jon Arryn closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he nodded. "A raven flies to Winterfell," he said. "Whether Lord Eddard comes or sends his daughters to remind you that you are a father as well as a king, he will answer." "Let him come," Stannis said without irony. "He is honest. I am tired of speaking with men who are not." Peter raised both brows as if wounded by an arrow of words that could not possibly have been meant for him. Varys smiled apologetically at no one. When the council had dissolved into tasks and mutters and nervous spills of ink, Jon Arryn went to his solar. The garnet ring still sat in its bowl. He put tea back on and felt its cool weight as one feels a familiar ache. He lifted the blue vial that Stannis had left on the table, turning it so that morning light filled it. He did not summon a page to carry it to Pycelle. He put it in the small iron-bound chest where he kept keepsakes that would look very strange laid out on stone after his death. Next to it, he placed a lock of hair the color of a winter crow's wing, bound with a thread that his wife had cut from her own sleeve when their son first laughed. The two looked absurd together, like a secret marriage. He closed the chest with a click. A knock as polite as a thief's sounded at his door. "Enter," Jon called. Varys slid in, all humility and silk. "My lord," he said, as to a man on a sickbed, "I have delivered word to certain persons that we would prefer retain their tongues. I have also sent eyes to watch the stables at the west gate." "Will there be an attempt?" Jon asked. "Is there a day in King's Landing when there isn't?" Varys asked mildly. "But today, yes. The Lannisters have always preferred to pull thorns before they bleed." Jon looked at him. He had learned long ago not to despise Varys for being what he was. The realm had room for many crafts if it wanted to avoid bleeding to death for the sake of pride. "And you, Lord Varys," Jon said, "do you bleed for the realm?" Varys smiled without a hint of teeth. "Always." Jon nodded. "Then you may yet save it when I cannot." "Oh, I think," Varys said softly, "that you have done more for it this morning than anyone will be allowed to sing about." He paused, as if listening to the hall for footfalls no one else could hear. "I thought you should know, my lord." The queen asked for quills and paper. "She writes." "To whom?" Jon asked, though he knew. "Her father, and a cousin in the west who is not so clever as he thinks and will ride too soon, too alone. We will not stop him." Varys's hands made a synonym of mercy. "We will watch him ride into a city that is not his and see if the people remember what a prince looks like on a horse. Do not be unkind," John said, though he was thinking of the simple geometry of men and horses and narrow streets. Be only sufficient. Varys bowed. Sufficiency, he said, is an art I admire in others. In myself, I find it dull. When he was gone, John stood for a long time by the window. The city had rounded itself to the day's business, as if morning had not found it and broken its shell. It steamed and rattled. Its hats bobbed. Its sellers shouted. Its cats went stealthily about their appointments. The river threw coins of light to anyone who cared to catch them. Somewhere a boy put a hammer on hot metal and found it answered better than any man had. Somewhere a girl with hair the color of something herb women hide under cloths counted out copper with a hand that shook, then held the coin in her fist until it became a kind of comfort. At midday a raven went north like a thought too bold to keep. At dusk, on a road that sloped west and stank of horse, a party of riders left the city with a scroll in a satchel and a purse heavy at the belt to pay for every man who would step aside without asking why. In a chamber with locks on both doors, a boy with hair like a field at harvest slapped a platter from a servant's hand and laughed when it shattered, because something breaking was a song in his throat. In the tower of the hand, an old man put his fingers on his temples and did not pray. He had already asked enough of the gods for one day. Tywin Lannister read his daughter's letter in a room he had made so clean with his will that dust had learned its lesson and stayed away. He stood as he read, because he did not give gravity a chance to lay hands on his spine when it wanted. He did not curse. He did not call for a horse or a sword. He turned to a chest, unlocked it, and took out a small knife. He cut the letter into thin strips and fed them into a brazier. He rubbed his thumb against his forefinger afterward as if to rid himself of the memory of ink. Then he called for his captains, because the old trick of turning pride into coin still worked whether the enemy was dragon, stag, or the little and determined man in the mirror who insisted on being right. At Winterfell, Eddard Stark held Jon Arryn's letter and felt the weight of the world shift under his boots with the stubborn slowness of ice breaking. He read the neat hand once. He read it twice. He looked across the hall to where his wife listened to a bard. He looked at his daughters, one sitting very straight to be the picture her mother liked, the other unable to sit at all for more than 3 breaths without sparking like dry kindling. He looked at the boy at his side who would one day find the world looking back at him first. "I must go south," he said, as the words followed the pathway of an old friendship and a vow that did not care what one wanted. "Take the girls?" Catelyn asked, already weighing dangers. "Not yet," Ned said. He folded the letter. "Not until I know what kind of south it is." South, gold buckled its armor and called it honor. South. A man who had once been poor and laughed about it measured a city in increments of favor and leaned on the scale with a delicate finger until the whole thing read true to him. South. A eunuch told his spiders to go to places they had already been, and invented for them entirely new corners within old rooms. South. A man whose sword had kept oaths longer than most kings had kept crowns sat in the dark and weighed whether that oath meant what he thought it once did, and what he would break to keep it. South. A queen denied men the gift of seeing her weep and made of her rage a garment more flattering than any seamstress could cut. Night fell because it had not yet learned how not to. Torches flared. Fear discovered that hunger could still be hungrier than it. In the dog yards, a bitch whelped and the last pup faltered, then took a stubborn hold on its mother's teeth and lived. In a cellar in Flea Bottom, a boy with hair like a raven's wing hammered a thin bar of metal and made of it almost a perfect circle, and when he did he sat back and looked at his hands as if they belonged to a god who had suddenly consented to lend them to him for a time. 2 days later there was blood in the streets. Not because the king ordered it. Not because Tywin willed it from far away. Because there were always men waiting to learn what side the city's shadow would fall on. And when it shifted they moved from corners into doorways and from doorways into the open. They named it justice when they dragged a Lannister groom from a stable and beat him clumsy. When a baker with a lion carved on his door was found with his head against his kneecaps in an alley. It was called accident until 3 more turned up and the word became a lie too large to swallow. Jon Arryn stood under the arch between 2 courtyards and watched the city try to decide whether it was afraid of itself. He sent the gold cloaks and then pulled them back and sent them again. He spoke to the king in the morning and to the watch at noon. He broke his fast with bread that had gone hard and regretted not taking the sweet rolls from Lisa's hand. Peter's men went among the guilds and whispered of wages unpaid if the city burned. Varus's men went among the mothers and whispered of bread if the city kept calm. Stannis counted ships and made the counting sound like a prayer. Renly laughed in the wrong places and learned to stop, which taught him more about himself than he had wanted. Pycelle wrote and wrote until his cramped hands seized and he had to rub his knuckles like an old man's. Barristan slept in a chair with his hand around the hilt of a sword he had been given as a young knight with knees that had not creaked. Joffrey tried to order a guard to drag a boy up to the tower because the boy had laughed. The guard bowed and did not move. Grown men learned how power changes shape when watched. Cersei listened to the street from her window, and when the moon came she wrote a second letter. This one never left the Red Keep. She lit it herself, and did not cry as the fire ate across the page. On the morning of the third day, a Lannister cousin rode into the fish market with 40 men behind him and a lion flying. He did not think he needed more to traverse a city his uncle meant to own. He had no idea there were more gold cloaks than he had counted, and that they had been promised double wages by a man whose coin came with smiles and bows and very sharp teeth. He did not know Varys's whisperers had named him already, so that at the first shout, shutters closed. He discovered he was riding in a street that had become a tube the color of clay, with knives for eyes. He tried to ride out. He learned what narrow means. Jon Arryn did not smile when he read the report. He put a hand to his belly where fear likes to sit like a fat cat and scratch with careful claws. He ordered the men caught to be taken alive and fed cleanly. He sent a man to the queen's door with words that did not ask if she felt softer or harder for the blood shed in her name. He went to the king and told him what had been done in the city's sight. Robert grunted at each phrase like a man receiving blows enough to feel still alive. "Then we will not burn the bakeries," Robert said heavily. "Send the men back to their mothers to say we are not their enemy if they keep the peace. If they do not." He did not finish, because he had finally learned to let a threat breathe in its own cage without letting it out. That night Jon Arryn slept in his bed, but only after he had pushed the mattress against a wall and put a chair under the door latch. When he woke in the dark, it was because he had dreamed that feathers had turned to snow and pinned him to the sheets. He got up and drank water until his belly sloshed. He sat with the book in his lap, the book that had been a lantern and was now a weight again. He turned pages without seeing them. He thought of Lisa, of the tremble in her hands, of a boy in a high place who coughed and used up his breath in games. He thought of a different boy in a different high place, sitting on the edge of a bed and wondering why the world had gone suddenly smaller without anyone making the room smaller. He thought of the future. It is a poor tool, the future. It can be shaped, and it remembers who has tried to shape it too often. In the West, Tywin Lannister's banners learned their way out of storage and met wind they had not tasted in years. He arranged his men as letters across a page, and each line meant profit to the man writing it. He sent ravens to lords who owed him and to those who did not yet know they would. He did not speak his daughter's name aloud when speaking of strategy. He did not have to. He kept his face as he had kept it when Aerys spoke foolishness, when Jaime grinned and confessed because he preferred the shape of defiance to the shape of denial, when the world changed the last time and had the bad manners to change without the courtesy of asking him first. On Dragonstone, thunder wrapped blue flame around the fortress, and Stannis looked at his castle as at a woman he did not expect to love and could not leave. He counted stores. He counted men. He thought of a red woman he had not yet met and did not think of her, because a man like Stannis would only meet miracles when he had eaten all the bread Reason had in the house and found himself still hungry. In the Stormlands, the small lords bent to the habit of that land the way the great trees bend towards sea wind without breaking. They would ride to Stannis when the letters finished their crossing, because law is a kind of wind too, and Stannis had wrapped himself in it not as a cloak but as a skin he could not take off. At Winterfell, Catelyn told her husband he would not go alone. He said he would. She named a price. Of sense and daughters and honor. He named a price of speed and trust. She won, because she had learned to count each man's stubbornness and pay it in coin of his own choosing. He rode south with men who would serve. He left a home with boys pretending not to see how their mother's eyes had learned to gather tears and lay them aside like linen. In King's Landing, the river watched everything and did not care because it had already seen cities founded and burned. The September cleaned blood in patterns more careful than the prayers spoken above it. Night sent rats and cats sent messages back. In the Red Keep, Jon Arryn put on his cloak to go to the Queen's cell and speak with her as a man speaks to another when there is no longer any use in either of them trying to charm or frighten the other. He took the blue vial from his chest and carried it in his palm the way one carries a memory, light and heavier than iron. Cersei looked up when he entered, and for the first time he saw her not as the queen nor as a role, but as a woman who had made choices because the world had taught her that choice was the only mercy it would allow her. The recognition did not soften him. Understanding is not surrender. "You have come to watch me beg," she said. She had washed and braided her hair. The braid made a rope he imagined her climbing in some other room, some other life. "No," Jon said. He set the vial on the table between them. She looked at it. He saw the flicker, and now they were two players staring at the same board with an old piece between them. "To ask why you tried to kill me." She smiled very slightly. "I could lie and say I did not, but you brought a maester's catalog to a holy place to accuse me of treason. Spare me the cruder games. I will spare you nothing. The realm may yet spare you much." "The realm," she said, and the word meant a joke to her. "The realm is a man's hammer and a woman's cage. I did what I had to. We all do." "You had to bed your brother?" Her eyes did not move. "You asked me to explain love to an old man who has learned to live on duty." Jon was not insulted. It was too accurate for that. "No. I ask you to explain treason to a woman who has the wit to know she is not the first in this city to commit it for a reason she chose to call love." She laughed then, a small, surprised sound. "We are more alike than either of us deserves," she said. She lifted the vial. "Did you bring me this to test whether I would use it? Or to make me think you would give me an easy exit?" "Neither," he said. "To remind you that, if you had waited a day, it might have worked." She set it down. "It still might." "I do not drink from your hands," Jon said. "And you will not drink from mine. Live, my lady. That will be the harder insult to us both." He left her then, because any more would have been vanity. He walked without his cane, because his knee had decided not to complain while his heart was busy. When he reached his solar, he found Stannis waiting. The Baratheon had a letter unopened in his fist and an opened one on the table. The opened one bore the sigil of a ship and a dragon, and the script within spoke of a girl married to a horse lord across the world and of a belly that might soon swell with foreign heirs. An old problem reintroduced at an impolite time. "Robert," Stannis said, as if the name could be sworn in like a witness, "will want to kill her." Jon closed his eyes. He saw a girl sold like a sack of grain and a boy named Rhaegar on a field no longer there. He heard Robert's voice say kill and heard Ned Stark's voice say no. He opened his eyes on Stannis's gaze and nodded once. Then he will have to remember that his hand is bruised and his hammer is elsewhere, and that he chose law this week, and the gods are watching to see whether that was merely a trick of light. Stannis grunted. It might have been approval, or the sound a man makes when biting into bread too hard to be pleasant and too necessary to put down. "Ned will come," he said. "Yes," Jon said. "Ned will come." By the time the Northern Lord's steps echoed under the vaulting of the throne room, the city had begun to learn to say the words that changed it. The queen is locked away. The prince is no prince. The king has named his heir and regret in the same sentence. The Lannisters ride. The Tyrells are listening, as roses do before the wind. The Riverlands are counting and finding themselves owed. The Iron Islands pretend they do not smell blood outside their waters and prepare to be disappointed by their own lack of timing. As always, a man can set a truth loose. He cannot decide what it eats on its way through the streets. Jon Arryn, in his last great act, had put a word into the world and watched it acquire teeth. But sometimes teeth are exactly what you need when a bone has been stuck in the throat of the realm too long for anyone to breathe. He sat with the black book shut and the blue vial hidden and thought, for a moment, of his mountains. Then he put his hand on the paper with its tidy script and felt something that was not pride and not relief and not joy. It was simply gravity. The world had taken his offering and accepted it because it was the sort of offering the world prefers. Blunt, unromantic, inarguable. When Ned Stark came into the council chamber smelling of horse and frost and a long road's honest dirt, he found Jon Arryn standing as he had always stood, with too much weight given to duty and too little to breath, and he laughed quietly and shook his head. "You old hawk," he said, "what have you done?" Jon turned his face toward his protege and brother in all the ways that matter, and for the first and only time that week let his mouth relax fully into a smile. "What needed doing?" he said. Ned's eyes went to the book. They went to Stannis. They went to the empty chair where Peter should have been, and to the shadow of Varys, and the lumbering bulk of Pycelle, and to the door WG. Renly had leaned until he learned to stand properly. He lifted his gaze to the ceiling as if listening to the gods. "Then let us finish it," he said gently, "before it finishes us." Outside, the bells rang for vespers, and the sound was no longer like metal trying to speak. It was like metal that had found its voice, however cracked it might be. The city listened. It would decide, as cities do, how much it would forgive and how much it would not. The sea went on with its work.